When you get old, the world becomes smaller in ways you don't expect. The house feels larger, yet your voice seems to echo less. People talk softer around you, not out of kindness, but caution. That's what I remember most about the years after my wife, Helen, passed. The quiet, the sort that hums through the walls after midnight, when the refrigerator buzz is louder than your heartbeat. I lived in the same house where my son, Michael, grew up, a quiet suburban street just outside town. Maple trees in the yard, mailboxes all the same color. It was the kind of place where life happened in whispers, sprinklers, wind chimes, the smell of barbecues on Sundays. When Helen was alive, the house was full of soft music and laughter that came from the kitchen. She loved to hum old Sinatra songs while stirring soup. When she died, the silence settled like dust, and I tried to live with it. Michael wanted me to move in with him not long after. "Dad, it's too much house for one person," he said. His voice was kind, but underneath there was that edge of worry. I told him I was fine. I told him I liked my routine morning paper, coffee, the radio in the background. But one winter, I slipped on the porch steps and broke my wrist. That's how they convinced me. Michael and his wife, Clara, came with smiles and concern. And before I knew it, I was packing boxes of my life into their SUV. Old photo frames, Helen's teacups, the clock that had ticked on our living room wall for 40 years. I told myself it was temporary, a few months, maybe, until I got stronger. But as weeks turned into months, the boxes stayed sealed in their garage, and my presence felt more like furniture than family. Still, I tried. Every morning, I'd make breakfast, early coffee for them, toast for myself. I'd read the news, water the plants, feed their cat. When they came downstairs, I'd smile and ask about their day. Michael worked long hours in finance, always on calls. Clara, she managed real estate. She was polite, maybe even kind in the beginning, but I could feel something distant in her eyes, a faint tension, like she wasn't sure where to place me in her world. It's strange, isn't it, how a house can hold warmth and cold at the same time? They'd talk about clients, new furniture, vacations, all things that didn't quite have a space for me. I'd listen, nod, laugh when I could. Then, when dinner was done, I'd wash the dishes alone. Some evenings, I'd sit by the window in the guest room, my new room, and watch the streetlights blink on. Sometimes I imagined Helen beside me in her old housecoat, looking out at the same street. She would have said something gentle like, "They're doing their best, George." And maybe they were. But something began to shift around that winter's end. I noticed how Clara would lower her voice when I entered the kitchen. How Michael would end calls a little too quickly when I passed by. And the quiet air of that house started to feel watchful. Still, I brushed it off. You tell yourself not to imagine things when you're old. You tell yourself people mean well, that maybe you're just out of step. Then came that night, the night that started at 11:58 p.m. I remember because the clock in my room ticked so loudly I could hear each second stretch into silence. The house was asleep, or so I thought. Rain was tapping against the window, steady and soft. I was reaching for my water glass when I heard voices, low, hushed, from the kitchen below. I could make out Clara's tone sharp but controlled, and Michael's quieter, almost pleading. I don't know what made me get up. Maybe habit, maybe fear, maybe something older than either, the instinct of a father sensing his name in a sentence not meant for him. I slipped on my slippers, opened the door, and stepped into the dim hallway. The stairway creaked under my hand. I leaned closer, just enough to catch the words. "He's not getting better, Michael. He needs care. We can't keep doing this." That was Clara's voice. Then Michael said softly, "It's my dad, Clara. He just needs time." Clara sighed. "Time? It's been 8 months. We barely have space to breathe. He forgets things. He leaves the stove on. What happens when something worse happens?" There was silence, the kind that presses on your chest. Then Clara's voice again, quieter now. "We have to think about us, about the baby." My hand froze on the banister. "Baby." My son's voice trembled, just a little. "You haven't even told him yet." "I can't," she said. "Not until we figure out where he's going to go, where he's going to go." Those words hung in the air like smoke. I stood there in the dark hallway, the rain whispering outside, listening to the two people I loved most talk about where I was going to go. She kept talking words about assisted living, about quality of life, about how I'd be happier around people my age. Each phrase was a polite stone dropped into a deep well, and I realized something. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was smaller, sadder, like I was standing outside my own life, watching the last light in the window go out. I went back to my room quietly. The clock ticked past midnight. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands on my knees, staring at the pattern in the carpet. They thought I was a burden. They thought I didn't notice the bills, the extra groceries, the care. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had become something heavy in their lives. Still, hearing it like that, not through kindness, but through planning, it does something to your heart. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, listening to the soft hum of the house, trying to find the point where love had quietly turned into obligation. The next morning, I acted as though nothing had happened. I made breakfast. I smiled. I asked Clara if she'd slept well. She said yes without looking at me. I could see the way she moved around the kitchen, now cautious, distant, polite. The same woman who once called me Dad. When she married my son, now avoided my eyes. Michael, on the other hand, looked tired. He poured coffee, thanked me, and gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. There was guilt there. I recognized it because I'd worn that same expression once years ago, when I had to put my own father in a care home. The circle had closed. Later that week, I started making small changes. I cleaned out my drawers. I organized my medicines. I even packed a small suitcase just in case they asked. But I also started writing. Every night, I'd sit by the window with a notepad and pen and write small letters to Helen. I wrote about the house, about the cat, about how the world felt a little less like home. And somehow, putting it into words made it easier to breathe. A few days later, I overheard Clara again, this time on the phone. Her voice was gentle, almost professional. Yes, we're looking for something with a garden view. He likes being near windows. That he was me. And maybe it was the way she said it, like she was talking about a piece of furniture being moved, that made something in me go still inside. I didn't hate her for it. I just felt old, older than my years. That night, I opened Helen's box of keepsakes. Inside were photographs, her wedding ring, a few of her letters to me. One line stood out, written decades ago when we were young. When the world forgets you, remember who you are to yourself. I read that over and over until it became a rhythm in my chest, and maybe that's when I decided what I would do next. Not out of pride, not even out of sadness, but out of love, the kind that still believes people can change, even when they forget how to see you. In the days that followed, I began to notice things I hadn't before, not because they were new, but because I finally saw them for what they were. A closed door that used to stay open, a meal portioned smaller than the rest. The soft sound of whispers behind walls, followed by the hush of guilt when I entered the room. No one said anything cruel, no one raised their voice, but it's the silences that tell you when love has started to fade. I carried on quietly, like a ghost who still remembered the steps of his old life. Every morning I'd rise early, make the coffee, fold the kitchen towel, and pretend not to notice the world moving past me. Michael was kind in his way. He'd ask if I needed anything, though he rarely waited for the answer. He was always rushing meetings, calls, traffic, life. I knew that rhythm. I had lived it once myself. Clara spent most of her time on her laptop, tapping away, her phone never far. She was efficient, organized, composed, the kind of woman who managed her home the way she managed a business. And somewhere in that efficiency, there was no room left for an old man's uneven footsteps. One afternoon, I found her in the kitchen arranging flowers. The sunlight caught the glass vase, and for a second I saw the girl she must have once been, hopeful, kind, unburdened. "Those are Helen's favorite," I said softly, pointing at the tulips. She paused. "Oh," she said, not looking up, "I didn't know." Then she smiled, thin and polite. They were on sale. It wasn't cruelty. It was indifference, the gentlest kind of erasure. That night, I went for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was cold, the street quiet except for the rustle of leaves. I passed homes with glowing windows, families laughing, televisions flickering, life spilling out into the night. And I thought about how strange it is to grow old. How you spend decades building a world for others, a home, a future, a safety, and then one day, you become the thing that doesn't fit in it anymore. I stopped by the park bench near the pond. Helen and I used to sit there in the evenings, feeding ducks and watching the water ripple. I sat for a long while that night, listening to the stillness. That's when the decision began to take shape, not as a plan, but as a feeling. I didn't want to be moved. I wanted to move myself, So the next morning I began preparing quietly. I called an old friend from my woodworking days, a man named Frank, who ran a small repair shop in town. He was surprised to hear from me, asked how I was doing. I told him, still breathing, still trying. He laughed and said, "That's more than most can say." I asked him if he still had that old cabin near the lake, the one we built half a lifetime ago for weekend fishing trips. He did. Said it hadn't been used in years, but the roof still held, and the water still ran clear. That night I didn't sleep again. I thought about Helen, about Michael as a boy, about how she used to say, "Let people show you who they are, then choose how to love them." So I chose not to fight. Not to beg, but to quietly leave before they had to ask me to. The next day I went through my things. I kept only what mattered: Helen's letters, one photo of the three of us, my father's watch, a few shirts, and my old Bible. The rest I folded neatly and left in drawers. I even wrote a note for Clara, not a goodbye, just gratitude. "Thank you for your kindness." It said, "You've taken care of me more than you realize." I meant it. Even if she never felt kindness in her own heart, I wanted her to read those words someday and maybe remember that grace isn't always earned. A week passed before I found the right day. They were both out, Michael at work, Clara visiting her sister. The house was still. I packed my bag, stood in the doorway, and looked around one last time. The living room smelled faintly of lavender cleaner. The cat slept curled on the rug. My framed photo of Helen sat on the shelf, the light catching the glass like it was winking goodbye. I whispered, "We did our best, didn't we?" And then I walked out. The air outside was crisp, the kind that wakes your lungs. I took the bus into town, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and my cane. Frank met me at the station with his old truck. He didn't ask too many questions, just patted my shoulder and said, "You're welcome to stay as long as you want." The cabin was smaller than I remembered. Wooden walls, a narrow bed, a small stove, but it felt like freedom. I cleaned it up, lit a small fire, and made tea, and for the first time in months I felt something loosen in my chest. That night I sat by the window, watching the moon reflect on the lake. It was quiet, not the heavy silence of someone else's house, but the kind that listens back. I wrote another letter to Helen. "I've gone to the cabin. Don't worry, I'm all right. The stars look the same. Maybe that's enough." Days turned into weeks. I started fixing little things: the door hinges, the railing, the steps. My hands still remembered the old motions, and each small repair felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Sometimes I'd drive into town to buy groceries. Once I saw Michael's car outside the hardware store. I didn't go to him. I just watched him for a while, the way he carried himself, the way time had added lines around his eyes. He looked tired, maybe guilty, maybe both, and I realized that leaving wasn't just for me, it was for him too. Sometimes love means stepping aside so someone else can breathe. One morning, about 3 weeks after I left, there was a knock on the cabin door. When I opened it, I found Michael standing there, out of breath, eyes red. "Dad," he said softly, "why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in," I said. He stood in the middle of the room, looking around at the tools, the fire, the half-finished shelf I was sanding. "This is where you went." I nodded. "It's peaceful here." He sat down on the chair across from me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly between us. Then he said, "Clara's been worried sick." I smiled faintly. "I'm sure she has." He looked down. "She didn't mean it like that, Dad. You know how she gets when she's stressed." I took a breath, slow and steady. "Michael," I said, "I've been on this earth 73 years. I know the difference between worry and wanting someone gone." He winced. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and I believed he meant it. "I'm not angry," I told him. "I just needed space, and maybe you did too." He looked up, eyes glassy. "I didn't want you to go. I just didn't know how to make things right." That's the thing about children. Even when they grow into men, they still speak like boys when they're afraid of losing love. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Maybe we both forgot how to talk to each other," I said, "but we can start again, just not in that house." He nodded slowly. Then he said something that surprised me. "Clara's pregnant, Dad." I smiled quietly. "I heard." He blinked. "You did?" "Yes," I said, "at midnight." For the first time he laughed, a small, shaky laugh that broke the heaviness in the air. "I guess you heard more than I thought." "I did," I said softly. "And it's all right." We talked for a while after that about the baby, about Helen, about memories that time hadn't stolen yet. Before he left, he hugged me. It wasn't long, but it was real. "Come visit when you're ready," he said. "I will," I told him, and for the first time I meant it. When he drove away, I stood on the porch and watched the dust settle on the road. There was peace in me, not because everything was fixed, but because the silence finally felt honest. That evening I made tea, lit the lamp, and sat with Helen's photo. The night outside was still, and I thought, maybe forgiveness isn't a word you say. Maybe it's just the way you breathe after the storm has passed. Spring came slowly to the lake. Each morning the ice withdrew a little farther from the shore, and the wind carried the faint smell of wet earth. I rose early, as I always did, to light the stove and watch the mist lift from the water. It was peaceful work, quiet, patient. I sanded the last plank of the small shelf I had been building, wiped the dust away, and set Helen's photograph on top. Her smile caught the morning light, the same gentle curve that used to steady me after long days. I found myself thinking less about hurt and more about time, how it wears edges smooth if you let it. Forgiveness doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in like sunlight through thin curtains. You don't notice it happening until the room is warm again. Michael called every few days. He never said much, just to ask how I was, if I needed anything, how the cabin felt. And each time I told him the same truth. "I'm all right, son. I've got peace here." One evening, Clara's voice joined his on the line. It startled me at first. I hadn't expected her to speak. "Hello, Dad," she said quietly. There was a tremor in it, something tender trying to find its footing. We talked about small things, the weather, the cabin, the baby kicking, and then she said, "I'm sorry if I made you feel unwanted." There was a long pause before I answered. "You didn't make me feel anything, Clara," I said softly. "I chose to feel left behind, that's on me." She breathed out, a sound between relief and grief. "Still," she whispered, "I wish I'd been gentler." Kindness has a strange way of coming back around even when it's late. Her words didn't erase the hurt, but they loosened it. After we hung up, I sat on the porch until stars appeared, tiny reflections trembling on the lake's surface. I thought about Helen again, about how she believed love was less about holding and more about seeing. Maybe that's what I was learning now, to see my family as they were, not as I wanted them to be. Weeks passed. The baby was born in early June, a girl. Michael sent me a photo on my old phone. She was wrapped in a yellow blanket, a tiny face pressed into Clara's shoulder. They named her Grace. When I saw that name appear beneath the picture, something inside me softened completely. Grace, the very thing we had all been reaching for without knowing. I wrote them a letter the next morning. I told them the cabin had been good for me, that I'd learned how to live quietly again. I told them they didn't need to worry, that I was proud, that I loved them. And at the end I added, "When you think it's time, bring Grace to meet the lake. It's where peace likes to hide." 2 weeks later, I heard tires crunching on the gravel road. I stepped outside, shielding my eyes from the sun, and there they were, Michael, Clara, and the baby bundled in her arms. They looked unsure at first, like visitors stepping into memory. But the moment Clara saw the flowers growing by the steps, Helen's tulips, the ones I had planted from old bulbs, she smiled. Still her favorite, she said softly. We spent the afternoon together, no grand apologies, no heavy talk, just small things, passing the baby around, laughing at how tiny her fingers were, sharing lemonade on the porch, the kind of peace that comes only when everyone is too tired to carry blame anymore. As the sun sank low, Michael asked if I'd ever think about moving back closer to town. I shook my head. "I belong here for a while," I said, "but you can visit as often as you like. Bring her to see the seasons change." Clara nodded. "We will." Her eyes met mine, steady, gentle, without the distance they once held. When they drove away that evening, I stood by the gate and waved until their car disappeared behind the trees. Then I sat on the porch, the baby's faint coo still echoing in my ears. The air smelled of rain and pine. The world felt full again. I thought about that night months ago. The whisper through the floorboards, the pain of realizing love had thinned, and I realized something simple. Maybe that moment wasn't betrayal at all. Maybe it was the sound of life shifting, asking me to let go. Getting older teaches you to stop chasing explanations. Not every silence is cruel. Sometimes it's an invitation to listen differently. That night, as the first drops of rain began to fall, I whispered to Helen's photograph, "They're going to be all right." And I think, somewhere beyond the quiet, she whispered back, "So are you." The rain grew steadier, tapping against the roof, soft and rhythmic. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of wet earth, and felt the kind of peace that doesn't need witnesses. Because forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a moment. It's a long exhale after years of holding your breath. It doesn't rebuild what was broken, but it lets the light in, and maybe that's enough.